Warning: the following lecture will contain minor and major spoilers for a broad variety of horror movies. So while I do apologize to those who are required to watch this video in its entirety for class, and while I will try to be vague, I do need to divulge into details to properly explain the importance of these films and the time periods and genres that they're in. With that out of the way, please follow me down the rabbit hole that we call horror. Grab a pen and a pad of paper because I bet you'll want to take notes of what movies you're going to want to watch after this lecture. We start in the late 1800s, the birth of horror. The first horror films were very short and not even called horror at the time. They were originally known as spook tales. The genre of horror wasn't titled or founded until the 1930s. A lot of the early horror films were lost due to the unreliable film stock of the early ages, but the few we're going to talk about tonight have managed to be saved for the viewer. There were two pioneers, three technically, that really made the horror industry boom. A few of the first films appeared early in the 1890s. How terrifying it must have been to see people captured in flickering film. Even if it wasn't the horror modern society is used to, one can just imagine the terror of something so unfamiliar occurring, as if they'd captured a ghost, a figment of their reality and creativity forever documented. The Lumiere brothers started the horror journey with short films, around half minutes, that featured skeleton puppets normally used to simply dance, fall apart, and come back together to entertain an audience. Rather than scaring the audience, it was to entertain them. But there was one filmmaker that took spook tales by storm, and we'll be focusing on him tonight. George Méliès. Now, the very first narrative horror film was George Méliès and The House of the Devil, which fell short on striking fear into the audience and was again more entertaining than spooky. The story of this film goes as such. We first see a bat fly into the room, and with some special effects that we can talk about later on, the bat turns into the devil. Then an evil spirit conjures a cauldron and an assistant to help the devil produce a woman from the cauldron. Suddenly, two cavaliers appear, and after the devil plays his tricks, causing one man to perish by the hands of the woman, the second cavalier saves the day and repels the devil. It goes without saying that this film is quite a lot, and entertaining is one word for it. Now, if that intrigues you at all, it certainly intrigued me when I watched it, please take the time now to go watch the brief 3-minute film that is known as the first narrative horror film. But George continued his endeavors in the horror film world, continuing to uphold his reputation as the father of varying horror fundamentals. His achievements in the cinematography world of horror is something to revel at, which we will dive into with, first, the stop-motion effect. The Vanishing Lady was the first film in 1896 with the stop-motion effect, popularized by Méliès for film, of course. This effect was a rather difficult practice in the 1890s. Méliès and other filmmakers had to physically slice apart their film and reintegrate it to create the stop-motion effect as we know it, or splicing at the time. We see this effect in The Vanishing Lady, where this film featured trick artist George Méliès and an unknown woman. I was unable to find the actress's name. In one moment, we can visibly see she's underneath the cloth. Then we see a blatant cut, and then Méliès reveals a skeleton. An amusing shock to the audience, I assume, but with another cut, we see our fair lady safe and sound. The next special effect that George Méliès is known for is the split screen, which came from, first, the Four Troublesome Heads in 1898. He again used splice editing as well as multiple exposure to create the effect of his head tripling on the stand. Now, this effect was done by using something called matte paintings, which was another popular special effects technique. It prevented the light from reaching the camera, leaving the area blank and free for editing. So Méliès would then rewind the film and remove some matte and or add more painting to the areas he didn't want to edit to replace the empty space with new film, in this case being his head. Then, with his film The Mysterious Portrait from 1899, we see the similar method from The Four Troublesome Heads of splicing and exposure being used to create the effect of the actor's double showing up in the portrait. Here we can see that Georges Méliès uses these special effects to create his films, and they were popular in horror, as he wanted it to come across as it was in films that were further produced in the 1890s. Again, please do take the time to look into, if not all three, at least one of these short films showing these special effects. You can really see where the effect is taking place, especially with the Vanishing Lady, and I find that to be very fascinating. All of these special effects were intended to create a more terrifying experience for the audience. And maybe it wasn't as successful in the late 1800s, but it certainly helped throughout the 1900s to present time. It all started to come to fruition in the early 1900s, when creators started to shift from imagination to recreation, and horror evolved to better understand and create what the audience craved from horror. Now, how have we evolved to better understand and harness people's fear and need for that terrifying rush? In the 1920s, throughout and after the Great War, filmmakers started redefining how they went about horror. We moved away from dancing skeletons and plain entertainment, and instead they wanted to redirect the terror of war towards the terror of film. Throughout the rage of war, horror films started to drift from strictly imaginary and whimsical plots to having deafening origin and reality. We started to see depictions of realism. Instead of stylized sets and backgrounds, characters in horror are now interacting with real-world places that the audience is familiar with, that the audience can place themselves in. This shift started to influence how directors and horror visionaries went about working on these new movies and productions. And realism was only going to become more sophisticated as time went on, right into 1927, when sound was popularly being brought to movies, and these talking films were here to stay. With new technology that could record sound onto film strips, silent films started to fall out of popularity. The new fad was talkies, as they were titled in the 1920s. Now, 1928 is where we have a lost film, The Terror. Widely considered to be the first horror film featured with sound, not a lot is known about this film. The Terror was a lost horror film from a year after sound was brought to movies. And after this tech was implemented far and wide into films, the realism in horror started to not only visually terrify the audience, it started to play with the viewer through an auditory experience. The melding of sound and film revolutionized the movie-making industry and practically pushed silent films out of the picture. And with horror, it brought to the table a wide expanse of new opportunities to frighten an audience. Now, there was a lot to be done with sound, and monster movies have been a staple theme of the horror genre since, to be humorous, I can say since the 1930s. And it's partially due to the fact that as horror started to shift from skeletons into more realism, this included more novel adaptations, particularly from the Gothic horror genre, of course. From Dracula and Frankenstein to well-known, renowned author R.L. Stevenson's work, Jekyll and Hyde, which we will discuss in the 1940s. Having monsters in films was a great technique in the horror genre to depict real-world issues. Frankenstein's monster has been widely considered, in simple terms, to be a depiction of the cruelness of human nature, the feeling of otherness. In this and many other film adaptations, director James Whale wanted to focus on the monster's tragic nature and less of the murderous rampage. This created a sympathetic creature tortured by scientific ambition, social neglect, and isolation. We see in Frankenstein that sometimes science can go too far, and a lot of the public thought maybe horror was getting to be a bit too much for consumption. Which brings us to the 1940s, where the genre started to decline, censorship ran rampant, and the audience was getting bored of the formulaic jump scares and storylines. The same monsters with the same hero saving the day. Things were getting a tad bit dull. But that didn't stop horror filmmakers. Even if there was a call for censorship of these films, worries of ill-minded individuals recreating the horrors featured, we can see the agreed-upon subject of horror in the 1941 adaptation of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. The mad scientist with two personalities, he was the exact representation of the horror pride can have inflicted on a person, as well as the dangerous nature of science. Then into the 1950s, with the Second War, people wanted more directly relatable horror films. The movie The Invasion of the Body Snatchers in 1956 was more fearsome and relatable for the audience of the 1950s. The basic premise of the movie is aliens from a faraway planet have started to invade Earth right under our noses by snatching people's bodies and turning them into mindless followers, with the one goal in mind: to create more. After the Second World War, everyone was scrambling against communism, so it's considered that the aliens in this film were to represent a silent takeover of some foreign entities. So horror was desperately trying to make subtle connections between reality and these creatures that were meant to represent complex experiences that the audience could relate to. Now, it wasn't until later on that filmmakers would find a way to truly harness human lives and experiences to create movies that truly reached terrifying depths. It just wasn't enough for them. That would come from the realization that stepping away from the formulaic monsters and science fiction horror genres opened up a new world of possibilities for these filmmakers. And yes, yada yada yada, if you're a huge horror buff, you know there are a ton of subgenres for these films. Fear manifests itself in a variety of forms. Hence the reason society and filmmakers have created a multitude of subgenres. The history of subgenres in horror could be an entire video in of itself. So, for the sake of time, I'll only cover a few that have been popular and popularized in recent years. But I will be covering a few more in the upcoming section of this video. But to start, I will talk about black horror or horror noir. This is known as films that focus on African American characters and their narratives. We see the first instance of this genre in 1968 with The Night of the Living Dead. Now, this is the first film centered around this subgenre and undoubtedly influential on the black horror genre in its entirety. This is due to the director's purposeful casting of Duane Jones as Ben, the first black actor to be casted as the lead protagonist in a horror film. So, as I stated before, the black horror genre centers around black characters, culture, and is normally created by black directors. The movie Night of the Living Dead followed our protagonist Ben through a zombie apocalypse, but a defining feature of this film comes at the climax, where Ben is shot to death by white vigilantes, who then proceed to burn the man. This ending scene, the burning, is reminiscent of lynching, and the director has stated he wanted to frame this film in the light of the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., which had taken place earlier that year. Then we have feminist horror, which is said to have come onto the scene after the landmark 1973 Roe v. Wade decision. And with the second wave of feminism, the 1970s had a world of horror centered around women and the personal stories people were looking for in their films, especially women audience. One film where we see a woman's anger and pain morphed into horror is from Stephen King's adaptive novel, Carrie, in 1976. The story Carrie follows a young woman in high school, ruthlessly bullied and isolated, not only in school, but at home as well. After years of torment, Carrie snapped, using her newly awakened telekinesis to wreak havoc on those she felt wronged her. We see all that hurt and anger routinely oppressed in women being unleashed without a care. The very ending of the movie is a climax of suppressed feminine rage. Now, in 1983 was the year body horror was a coined term for the films we've seen in the past. Thank you, Philip Brophy, for your article exploring contemporary horror. I will show an excerpt of this article in the slides for you to peruse in your own time if you so choose to. Now, the earliest instance of this subgenre was in 1955 with The Quatermass Experiment, based on its televised predecessor, which I have not had the pleasure of seeing just yet. But in 2025, we see the film The Substance, released in 2024, be nominated for awards, one being Best Picture, making history as the first body horror film to be considered for the Best Picture award. But my personal favorite body horror film I will touch on just a little later. Why does this matter for human-centered design? Well, directors of horror films need to harness human emotion and fear to create cinematic mastery that is directly targeted to strike numbing fear in the audience. We've seen this in the three subgenres that I've just talked about, all coined and created and worked around to strike fear into our audience. Horror is inherently human-centered. Now, as we step into the 2000s, I believe this is where not a lot of new things happened in the genre, per se, unless you count some sort of future predictions, which in the very first scene of Final Destination from 2000 exactly is set in an airport where a student passenger foresees their plane crashing and in a fit of distress gets himself and multiple others kicked off. In the next few minutes, they see his vision come true. This movie was just 1 year before 9/11, another national tragedy that undoubtedly influenced horror films. But we already covered that in the 1900s. So, to bring us truly into the present day, here are a few modern 2000s horror movies that I believe have connotations for being human-centered with a mix of genres that we've already covered. Now, from when I covered the body horror genre, I mentioned that there was a favorite film of mine that is a body horror film. Now, that film is Tusk from 2014, which is known as a body horror film that has a lot of tangled history behind it, but the general premise of this film is to shock and horrify the audience. Within the first possibly 20 minutes of the film, we see the lead character, Wallace, being taken advantage of, and our antagonist, Mr. Howard Howie, is restricting and violating Wallace's body. Wallace no longer has control over what happens to him. His autonomy is stripped away violently with no warning. He's not able to protect himself. He can't. He's disabled. Next, Get Out is a 2017 film, and Us is 2019, which are both horror noir films directed by the one and only Jordan Peele. Known for his comical work in comedy, The director Peely is a visionary when it comes to horror films. I was even surprised to see that he was the director for Get Out when I first watched it. But now I am an avid viewer of his horror films. Now, most, if not all, of his works that I've seen so far centers around the experiences of his black lead characters and makes some kind of commentary on society through the helpful lens of black horror. For example, in Get Out, Jordan was creating a statement of modern racism, or liberal racism more pointedly. The white antagonists in the film fetishize black bodies, and horrifically go as far as to violate and steal their bodies, symbolizing contemporary slavery. Get Out forces viewers to confront reality. Racism is still alive and horrifically well. Meanwhile, in his film Us, with a black lead family and a black antagonist family, makes comments on classism and the societal others. A wonderful film that touches on sensitive topics that some viewers otherwise would be happy to ignore. Jordan Peely is a fantastic director, and I highly recommend going to see some of his films. The Invisible Man, released in 2020, is a fantastic feminist horror film that stars one of my favorite actresses, Elisabeth Moss. This film explores female empowerment and domestic violence. The Invisible Man acts similarly to Carrie as a feminist revenge story. Elizabeth's character, Cecilia, dominates every scene. The story is hers, and this film will not let the audience forget that. Our entire focus is on our heroine. We follow Cecilia in her escape from her abusive partner, who then refuses to leave her alone. As a tech genius, he fashions an invisibility suit in order to continue to torment Cecilia. No one would believe her. The antagonist is forcing her to create a narrative that frames her as crazy. Yet, in the same turn, it forces Cecilia to take matters into her own hands, giving the audience a very fulfilling ending. And finally, in 2025, we have Sinners. Now, this is a beautifully done horror noir film. A lot of lead characters were familiar faces that drew the audience into the film, but they stayed for the embedded, personalized stories that were relatable and forced the audience to take another deeper look at racism. A lot like Jordan Peele's films and the original horror noir, The Night of the Living Dead, Sinners, while being a vampire monster movie, takes itself a step further by exploring racism in 1940s Mississippi. And if that's not enough to get you intrigued, I sure hope you at least go watch for Michael B. Jordan and a new actor that really took a step forward in this film and embodied his role. Wonderful film, wonderful horror noir film. Now, to end off this lecture, if you haven't heard any films you'd want to take a gander at yourself, here are a few of my own favorite horror movies that I highly recommend. First being The Silence of the Lambs, which is a psychological horror film starring Jodie Foster as Clarice Starling, a top student at the FBI Academy who has been recruited by a detective hoping she could help in a fresh case by interviewing infamous serial killer Hannibal Lecter. Then we have Seven, which is a thriller psychological horror, also a crime thriller featuring Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman as detectives tasked with one unsettling case that seems to have close ties to the Seven Deadly Sins. Lastly, we have in The Tall Grass a Lovecraftian horror adapted from Stephen King's novel, which, Lovecraftian as defined, emphasizes the horror of the unknown, named after the famous author known for his mystical and incomprehensible works in horror, H.P. Lovecraft. And it's safe to say this horror film leaves you terrified and questioning what you had witnessed. Now, I want to leave off with a huge thank you for sticking with me to the very end, and please make sure to watch some of these movies with a lamp. things that used to be so mundane can be terrifying in the dark.